Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to send a document over to the organizers that can give you some general overview of what we did, but we don't, there's not a lot of time. So I'm going to talk about two things. We had to do an alternative approach to the campaign, and then I'm going to talk about the research. We couldn't use the neon neck approach. And one of the reasons was our regional Jewish Voice for Peace felt that this was sort of a conflation. As Brother Joseph said, brutality in the US preceded these trainings, preceded Israel's existence. And the other reason is we did have a racial justice group, but it was not run by BIPOC individuals. It wasn't run by minorities. It was run by a Zionist organization. And they were pretty firm about, you cannot bring that story into any conversation about the police. So we had to take a different approach. We had to look for different partners. And we started off with research. And our aha moment was this guy. This is George Salem. He's with the Anti-Defamation League, and he's the one who runs the law enforcement trainings for ADL. Now, we knew George very, very well because for about 5 years, he'd been in our county at presentations. He'd been authoring papers about us with our chief of police, because for those years, he was at the White House and he was running a surveillance program called Countering Violent Extremism. So that's George in the back. This is our Montgomery County delegation, which includes our chief of police, assistant chief of police. Our schools were involved in the surveillance program. The African American is our county executive. The woman in the middle is an FBI agent. She's a very well-known Islamophobe. She's been aligned with Steve Bannon and Sheikh Kabani, and she ran this program. And basically, CVE claims that they can predict who's going to be a terrorist by risk factors. And if you see homesickness starred there, that's because we actually had a Muslim youth that was put through the counseling center as precursor to terrorism. And it only served Muslims. And as it was going on, our police were running around the country trying to sell the program, saying that they were gathering intelligence about terrorism. So back to George. George runs the law enforcement trainings for the ADL, but he also runs the CVE program for ADL. They're trying to sell this program, which is inherently racist. It targets Muslims. And so our theory is that these are not really trainings, but they're more like a timeshare pitch, that they're really trying to sell these surveillance programs to these police departments when they get back. So we started looking at some of the puzzle pieces. We looked at the agendas, and the sessions were only like an hour long, and they weren't really enough to do a hands-on training. They really focused on two things: fear mongering, which if you're going to sell counterterrorism, you have to sell terrorism. And the other is just these bonding opportunities where you can see Israel is just like us. They do the same things. They support the same things. And it's really the style that's used for grooming, like predators grooming, to get them so that when you go back, you can convince them to work with you. So we wanted to put the puzzle piece together to see if it fit. And it seems like they're only training chiefs of police. So they aren't training actual policemen who are doing traffic stops. They're training the decision makers who decide which programs to adopt. We looked at the actual justifications, and they all pretty much said the same thing. We're learning counterterrorism, and that Israel is just really, they know what they're doing. And then we saw a Baltimore Sun article with a captain in the police force, and he was talking about, he openly said, I'm learning illegal things. And he wasn't talking about tactics like neon neck. He was talking about profiling. But the biggest puzzle piece for us was our chief of police, Chief Tom Manger. He's now the chief of police for the Capitol Hill Police. But GINSA, which is another agency that does these trainings, they realized these were expensive to bring these police chiefs over. So they said, let's bring 5 officers to teach the police in the United States. So this picture is cropped, but there were probably about 80 people that were taught in Montgomery County by these intelligence officers. Again, that was like a day, so you weren't going to teach them a lot of tactics. They're all in their, sitting down, but they went to two other places. They went to Minnesota, Minneapolis, and anybody who knows about the CVE story, they know that Minneapolis was an early adopter of the surveillance program, and they went to you all. I don't know your CVE story. I know you do have a grant. I do know the regional training was done by Sheriff Gore. But what's interesting about you all is GINSA, the other thing that they like to have access to is they want to get into military installations and they want access to military personnel. And so that same year, they actually got access to Camp Pendleton. And when they get access, they're actually looking at like new weaponry or new products. So the other reason why I think it's really helpful for San Diego to sort of learn this alternative is I know that you guys had a flurry of letters to the editor, and props to you guys because we didn't even get that far, but you had a lot of pushback where the ADL and the officers were saying, no, we're not doing police protest suppression, but maybe you could also incorporate the counterterrorism profiling and which are predominantly targeting Muslims, and that might be something that would be harder for them to address. So I wanted to also talk, Kathy asked me to mention a little bit about Freedom of Information Act. And these are really treasure troves of information. And we tend not to use them in our toolkit. And I think the reason why is you've got these like the New York Times or the ACLU, and they go for big buck. It's very, they do need lawyers, they do need court cases, but for you and I, it's basically an email. And the document that I'm sending to you all will give you a sample to do. So you can actually get these records and find out what's going on. So what we found out was we found out who went. So our current chief of police was supposed to go in 2018. He didn't because of a death in the family. So that really lit a fire under us that we needed to go ahead and see him because it was on his radar. We find out who approves the trip. We have not found any elected official that signs off on it. It's usually somebody low level within the police department, like a training division, or in one case, we had a city administrator who's a bureaucrat. And we find out who pays for the trip. So you have GINSA, you have the AJC, you have the ADL, and they're pretty coordinated. You can tell that they're talking to each other the way that they're coordinating the visits. And we found information that didn't apply to Montgomery County. That officer had left. So we made sure that we shared it with other entities. And there's a website called Palestine is Here where you can look up to see what locally officials have gone on these trainings. We got to see the actual agenda and itinerary. And what we did was we had a playbook. So we itemized chronologically each of the activities. And that's a way you can connect the dots and see the pattern. So you can see who's the first one who went and sort of how things branched out. And it's really informative. You also find out what you don't get. So this training that I talked to you about where the Israeli officers came here, our police department said they have nothing. They don't even have an email from a secretary saying I'm picking up bottles of water. That's a big red flag. So that's something we can follow up on. So sometimes what they don't tell you is just as important as what they do tell you. So the last thing that I want to mention is we reached out to Mosawa. Mosawa, I call them the NAACP of Israel. So 21% of Israelis are not Jewish. And as a frame of reference, 13% of us in the United States are African American. And yet we call Israel the Jewish state, and it's very offensive if we call the US the white nation. But nonetheless, that's what's being played. So we asked them if, you know, what about this suppression analysis? Do you think that's right? And they gave a couple examples. So the documentation that I'm giving you will have this quote, but actually their founder and director had a personal experience where he was in a police station and he was being beaten up in front of everybody. It would have probably not made the news, except he was well known to the European Union, and they actually put up a big stink and said, you've got to prosecute the officer who did this. The reason I'm telling you this is, you know, we're all sort of understanding now that we need to put impact to community central. So I want you guys to, I'm giving you guys this quote, and I want to give it to everybody else to actually use if possible. But the other thing is when we looked at the agenda, there were 3 different agenda items that focused on the minority population. And Israel Hasbara, their propaganda machinery, is very, very careful to make sure that nobody really understands what's going on inside of Israel, because you can say what's going on in the occupied territories, that's terrorism, or we're complaining, that's anti-Semitism. But when you talk about what's going on inside of Israel, all of a sudden it comes out that really what's going on here is racism. So I will stop there.